the newsletter or the podcast, basically every member of my family, including myself, got sick in the past 2 weeks. And so there's just been no time for anything except for looking after people and working. But hopefully we're back on track now. So in this week's episode, we're going to be discussing the housing market in China and whether or not it's on the verge of collapse, what the problems in the market are, and what the government is planning to do about it in the future. A couple of episodes ago, we discussed the sort of like part one of this episode. So we discussed the rapid urbanization of China in the post-Mao era and also a little bit during the Maoist era as well. And so this is kind of like a follow-up to that. Basically, what happens when China enters the market economy, introduces sort of like free capitalism and allows private companies to enter the real estate market, and how that's basically spiraled out of control today and led to the situation that China is in now, where you have huge property developers that are worth billions on the verge of collapse and threatening to bring down the entire economy with them. So let's start with a really brief recap of the previous episode about urbanization. So what we discussed was essentially that the Chinese Communist Party and the government, local governments, essentially controlled every single aspect of real estate development, urbanization, city building, infrastructure, all of that. There were basically no private companies that were allowed to be involved before the reform and opening up era. This all changed in the 90s when the government was more actively encouraging urbanization because China was entering the global financial system. China was becoming the factory of the world. And so urbanization was necessary for China to develop the sort of industrial base that it now has, where it's now considered, like the manufacturing hub of Asia. The 90s is when people start exporting all of their manufacturing to China, and that's where we get all our cheap goods from today. Originally, when people were moving from the countryside to these newly built cities, to these special economic zones like Shenzhen, they were given public housing as part of the Chinese iron rice bowl system. But the more people moved, the less there was housing available for them, essentially. People were complaining as early as the mid-80s of like 5-year-long wait list for a house that would fit their entire family. And instead you had families crammed into one-room apartments waiting for the government to provide something for them. So in order to alleviate this issue, the government finally allowed private companies to enter into the real estate market. However, a lot of these companies were cash poor and didn't actually have a way to finance any of their projects. So in 1995, the government introduced a new law that would allow companies to essentially borrow money against buyers' mortgages. So this is known now as the presale law. So essentially what a presale is that you sell a property that hasn't yet been built. It can be completely off plan, or it could be sort of like partially built. You ask the buyer for the mortgage, so they have to pay a deposit and then get the financing from the bank for a mortgage. And then you use that as leverage to borrow money from the bank. You say, I've got this capital. You go to the bank, and then they give you a loan to finance the actual construction of the project, which you will then pay back as the buyers pay back their mortgage over time. So this caused like a huge boom in China's real estate property development. So in 1991, China had 4,200 property developers. 4 years later, that number had jumped to more than 33,000. That's about 8 times as many property developers, which is crazy. And by 2010, China's property market had become the largest in the world. By 2019, there were 100,000 active real estate companies. And by 2021, almost 90% of houses were bought on presale. Now, it's quite common to buy properties on presale, I would say, in other parts of the world. However, I don't think it's as common as it is in China. In China, it's kind of like standard practice that you would buy a property this way. In the UK, we do have that. I'm sure you have it in other parts of the world as well. But it's quite rare, I would say, that you would buy a property completely off plan. Usually a developer would have finished at least some of the homes so that people can go around and see them, and then buy a home that would potentially have exactly the same spec. In China's pre-sale system, only 25% of the development has to be completed before you go onto the pre-sale market. So potentially you could buy a home where you don't know what it looks like at all and could end up looking completely different to what you think you've bought, which we will discuss later because that turns out to be a real problem with this. Something else that's interesting about the pre-sale system in China is that obviously China's per capita income it's between like 10 and 15,000 US dollars on average. So Chinese people do not earn that much money, and yet they're taking out these huge mortgages that are like 8 to 10 times their income in order to buy these brand new homes that they've never even seen before. So a question there would be, why would someone who earns relatively little money be willing to fork out what is essentially their life savings, potentially their parents' life savings as well, because often people's parents help them pay for their first home in China. Why are they willing to fork that out for a home that they've never even seen before on a promise that it will be built one day? So the answer to that question lies partially in China's culture. So here's how one article puts it. First, China has substantially higher savings rate relative to developed countries. According to China's National Bureau of Statistics, the ratio of aggregate savings by households and firms relative to the national GDP grew to over 50% in the 2000s. Second, China's relatively underdeveloped financial markets offer few investment assets for households and firms to invest their savings, and they are prevented from investing their savings in global financial markets. As a result, housing is often used as an investment asset, not just as a consumption good. Third, to make matters worse, the largely unbalanced gender ratio between boys and girls in China means that boys face substantial competition in the marriage market. As home ownership serves as an important status symbol, the competition in the marriage market adds to demand for housing. You've got other factors in there as well, such as the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, China's economy, its GDP has been growing so quickly. People believe that their incomes would also grow. They had no reason to suspect that something awful, say like a global pandemic, might suddenly bring their incomes crashing down or threaten their livelihoods and stop them from being able to pay back their mortgages. There was also the belief that the real estate market was too big to fail. It's kind of like the rose-tinted view that I guess we had in the West as well. Prior to the 2008 financial crash, many people were blindsided. Even though there were some people who were ringing alarm bells, I would say the general public was largely unaware that there was sort of any problem at all, because line goes up, essentially. The financial market seemed to be performing well, everyone was making money, and all the finance bros were like doing cocaine and going to strip clubs, and everything seemed to be absolutely fine. So you have the same problem in China where it's like, well, there are new developers coming out all the time, all of these apartment buildings are always going up. What's the problem here? And the real issue is that all of this debt is sort of hidden, right? Or it's not mentioned, and that it's all sort of like behind closed doors until something goes wrong. Then you have this like huge watershed moment where everything comes to light and you reach this sort of critical boiling point where the whole market overheats and then the crisis ensues. So interestingly enough, like with the 2008 crisis, there were people ringing alarm bells as early as 2005 in China, one of those institutions being the People's Bank of China, which acts as China's central bank. They wanted to stop the pre-sale market entirely. They knew that lots of companies were over-leveraged and wouldn't be able to handle the amount of debt that they had taken on, and they were calling on the central government to basically do something about that. One of the reasons that they were calling for changes to the system is because they recognized that there was a lot of fraud going on. So one of the practices that a lot of these developers would do would be to fake mortgages. So like I said, you would have to sell basically all of the homes in advance of taking out a loan with a bank. And so what companies would do is they would basically get their own employees. So a property developer would get their own employees to sign up for a mortgage and pretend to be a homeowner, or just generally fake mortgage papers in order to get a loan from the bank. Another problem was that when mortgage payers did start giving property developers money for the build, the money was supposed to go into like an escrow account that the property developer wouldn't be able to touch until after the project was complete, and then they could pay back their debts. However, due to bribery, corruption, skimming off the top, etc., lots of this money just went straight into the property developers' own bank accounts instead of going into this escrow account. And a lot of property developers mishandled that money. shall we say, or just ran off with it without actually building the properties as promised. And also you have the problem of just generally shoddily built properties that are called tofu dreg houses, which is quite funny. So if you don't know, when you make tofu the traditional way, you get like the dregs that nobody wants to eat at the bottom. It's kind of like the leftover portion.
这是业主刚交付的房子，我不知道大家看了这个房子是什么心情。5楼、4楼、3楼，甚至到2楼，都是全通透的。这种通透让人心碎啊。
After residents reported problems with their homes, a government official visited the site. He was stuck in the elevator for about 20 to 30 minutes because the elevator broke down.
And so that's what these like poorly built properties are referred to in China, where, you know, they're just falling to pieces, or the fittings and furnishings are like really bad. The elevators don't work. Everyone's seen like an internet video with an elevator like crashing down, or like fake bricks crumbling in people's hands and things like that. So this is something that people were becoming aware of. You know, the faster that these places were being built, the more corners were being cut, essentially. And then you also had the problem of ghost cities. Like I mentioned earlier, Chinese people don't have a lot of investment vehicles that they can invest in. You know, in the West, for example, in the UK, you can buy stocks and bonds and shares in companies. You can open up an ISA and, you know, get fixed interest rates and things like that. China's investment and financial institutions are not as developed yet. And so then one of the main vehicles of investment is property. And so you get, like I've mentioned in the episode on urbanization, you get ghost cities built up where people have bought the properties but no one lives there because they've bought it as an asset that they just assume will appreciate in the future. Because you've got a lot of developers running away with funds and not actually completing on the projects, you get something called lanweilou, or rotten tail buildings, lying in the middle of cities. So these are like the unfinished buildings. They're just like empty shells that should have been built into homes but are just lying dormant with construction halted for whatever reason. So apparently today, around 5% of the apartments under construction in 50 major cities, or around 71 million square meters of property, are now these lanweilou. So the Chinese government did take some action to try and stop the problem before it got any worse. But ironically, in doing so, they kind of brought the situation to a head. So in August of 2020, they introduced a policy known as the 3 red lines. And so the 3 red lines were supposed to regulate a property developer's debt ratios. So it's debt to cash ratio, debt to equity ratio, and debt to asset ratio, so that they wouldn't be over leveraged and therefore be unable to pay back their debts in the future. The 3 rules were that a company's liability should not exceed 70% of assets, net debt should not be greater than 100% of equity, and money reserves must be at least 100% of short-term debt. Immediately that these rules came into effect, it revealed all of the problems underlying the system, and I think it was something like half of the major 30 property developers in China had broken at least one of these rules within 1 year. So immediately, by introducing this rule, the government, I don't know whether it was unwitting or part of their plan, revealed what the major problems with the system were. It's through the introduction of this rule that you get the sort of biggest story that most of you have probably heard of, which was the Evergrande property developer crash, almost bankruptcy, that started to emerge in 2020, 2021, and spill over into 2022, and is still unresolved till today. Evergrande is one of China's largest property developers. It's actually the second largest. It was founded in 1996. So this is just as the property boom is starting up. The presale law was introduced in 1995. So they're immediately able to take advantage of that and start building up their place in the market. In 2009, Evergrande was listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, became the second largest property developer in China. In 2018, it was the most valuable real estate agency in the world. Then it started to sort of diversify its holdings. So it's no longer just a real estate company. They own an electric car company, they own several sports teams, they've got their own like mineral water brand, they've got retirement communities. It's just a big corporation, basically. But their main operation is still property development. The founder, Hui Kaiyan, of Evergrande, used to be Asia's richest man. And even after Evergrande started collapsing, still had assets worth over $10 billion. So Evergrande was doing very, very well. So by 2020, it was revealed that Evergrande had debts of over 30 billion US dollars. Now, again, this would not necessarily have been revealed or have been a problem because obviously they had been operating, they'd become really huge. They were obviously generating income, but obviously between the 3 red lines policy and the pandemic, things were shook up. Essentially, the whole operation was revealed. That level of debt proved to be too much of a burden. In August of 2020, a letter started circulating online that was allegedly written by Evergrande to the Guangdong provincial government that basically said that Evergrande would not be able to pay back its debts, and if the debts were called in, the company would fold. At the time, Evergrande vehemently denied writing this letter and said it was like falsified by someone, but the damage was done, essentially, and immediately things started to go wrong. Firstly, Evergrande's credit rating was downgraded. It had a B+ rating, and then it sort of dipped over the course of a year to like a triple C or like a D rating by 2021. And in August of 2021, it had some of its loans called in and it failed to pay them back. That was like the first shockwave to the system. Like, okay, this company really is broke. They really don't have any money and they are on the verge of bankruptcy. The company quickly started selling off assets to try and stave off complete collapse. It was too little too late. Eventually, their share value continued to slip until it had lost over 90% of its original value. And eventually, in early January 2022, trading of Evergrande's shares was halted completely and its assets were frozen. So a lot of people at the time were like, oh my goodness, is this beginning of China's 2008? Is Evergrande, the Lehman Brothers of China? Is this the end of China's economy and its housing market, essentially? I think all over the world, people, and by people I mean millennials, have been waiting for a housing crash to happen and like the bubble to pop and the prices to come crashing down. But the Chinese government was really against that happening. There were lots of foreign companies and foreign financial firms that had shares and interest in either Evergrande directly or, in like their subsidiaries. And so it would have caused a huge shockwave throughout the world if Evergrande had fallen. Lots of dominoes would have come down with it. So it was in China and also the world's best interest that Evergrande didn't completely fold in on itself. However, despite the government's intervention, there was still a huge effect on the Chinese economy and especially the housing market in China. One after another, lots of companies were declaring bankruptcy or declaring that they wouldn't be able to pay back their loans or they wouldn't be able to finish building projects. Throughout China, lots of projects were put on hold and you end up with lots of, again, these lanweilou popping up all over the place. People who are paying mortgages on buildings with no updates at all from the developers. So this sparks a sort of protest movement in China, a very unusual one, whereby basically lots of different mortgage payers who are waiting for their incomplete homes bandy together to stop paying their mortgages and to basically go on boycott until they receive the homes that they've already sunk like 50 or 60 grand into. So here's one of the stories of one of those boycotts. For Kwang Hong, joining China's mortgage strike movement in July has had several personal consequences. His credit rating has tanked, dashing his hopes of starting a business. He's had to deal with repeated angry calls from the bank, and he risks being blacklisted via the social credit system, making it impossible for him to buy luxury goods, take a flight, or even ride a high-speed train. In this corner of East China's Jiangxi province, the resolve of mortgage strikers like Kwang appears to be hardening despite months of punishments and threats. Many have seen their incomes decline steeply amid China's economic slowdown and feel they have nothing to lose. Their only hope, in their view, is to face down the banks and authorities and win. More than 340 strikes in over 100 Chinese cities have been announced so far. Kwang's group is a typical example. Its nearly 1,000 members all bought apartments inside the second phase development at Scenic City, a residential complex in Nanchang, the capital of Jiangxi province. Originally, the developers said it would complete their homes by November 2021, but months later, the buildings remained little more than concrete shells. Repeated rounds of negotiation with the developer and local officials went nowhere, so when the buyers heard about other groups of aggrieved homeowners launching mortgage boycotts in late June, they decided to follow their lead. All 8 of the buyers we spoke with at Cynic City said they were determined to continue the boycott, even if that meant being sanctioned and blacklisted, until their homes were delivered or construction properly resumes. Kwang originally bought his 900,000 yuan apartment at Cynic City in 2019, when construction on the project was just beginning. To secure the property, he had to pay the developer a 300,000 yuan down payment up front and begin making monthly mortgage payments immediately. It was a huge investment for the 20-something, who works as a salesperson in the construction industry and was earning just under 10,000 yuan per month at the time. But the new home meant everything to him. He was keen to get married, and in Jiangxi province, young men who don't own a property often struggle to find a partner. As of September, 987 households had joined the Cynic City mortgage boycott, around 1/3 of total buyers. Kwang took an entire week to decide to join the boycott, as he was worried about losing his good credit rating. For years, he dreamed of starting his own business, but that would be impossible if he was unable to take out a loan. In the end, however, Kwang realized that he could no longer afford to worry about his credit rating. His employer had recently cut his salary to just 7,000 yuan a month amid China's economic slowdown, and his finances were even more stretched than before. The mortgage was now swallowing up more than half of his income. Now it's important to keep money in my pocket and live, he said. Since July, Chinese authorities have repeatedly stressed the need to get Lanwei Law completed. A raft of new policies have been proposed, including launching enormous bailout funds and offering special loans to developers through policy banks. Since the cash arrived, construction at Cynic City has picked up pace. There are now 200 to 300 workers on site per day, according to the buyers. But it's still not enough. Cynic Holdings Group estimates it needs at least 400 million yuan to complete the project, and the developer has yet to issue a detailed schedule for when it can deliver the finished homes. Based on the current rate of construction, it might take several years for the complex to be completed. So that's just one example, and I read lots of examples just like that one that just showed how desperate and, life-threatening this situation is for a lot of people. Got entire families who basically are not able to do anything or even, make a living or save any money at all because they're paying for 2 households, one of which may never even exist. Bearing all of this in mind, bearing the precarious financial situation of these property developers, bearing in mind the harm that it's doing to the economy, to individuals, the instability that it's causing in the social fabric of China, you might think, hey, surely the government's going to call this off, right? And completely end this pre-sale system and make all of these companies deliver on their projects and then wrap up their debts and, if necessary, declare bankruptcy and just close down trading completely. But you would be wrong. So despite all of these problems, the government basically has no choice but to continue with the pre-sale market, at least for the time being. There are many, many reasons for this. First of all, China's property market is one of the most expensive in the world already when you take into account the price to income ratio, right? So we discussed earlier just how high mortgage borrowing can be. But if you ended the pre-sale system, the cost of housing would only get more expensive because, first of all, you would have no supply to keep up with the demand. So people would be forced to buy existing properties, which are already more expensive than off-plan buildings for some reason. Secondhand homes in China are more expensive than new homes, which I don't think is the case in the UK. I think it's about the same. It's more about location in the UK and the size of the property. It's not so much whether or not it's an old or a new property. Often it doesn't really make that much of a difference, but it seems to make a big difference in Chinese cities, especially in the more expensive cities like Shanghai and Beijing. Speculators believe that if you pause the pre-sale system, there'd basically be a panic about housing supply. Inflation would skyrocket, and a lot of people would panic even further and cause the prices to go up as well. And like I mentioned earlier, you've got this issue of owning a property, owning a home being a cultural issue as well. It's not in the government's best interest to exacerbate the marriage problem because that exacerbates the child problem. I talked about this in a newsletter that I wrote recently about China trying to encourage people to have 2 or 3 or more children, and how they're introducing all of these different schemes to try and get people to have more kids. And here's another article that talks about the relationship between the property market and also the sort of marriage and child problem as well. Skyrocketing real estate prices in big cities are another major concern for urban couples. Whether or not a man owns a property has become a symbol of financial stability and security in modern Chinese society. According to the China Daily Survey, around 69% of single women suggested that their future husband had to own a house before they would agree to marry him, while only 10% accepted rented flats. According to sociologist Sandy To, parents of the groom had to pay bride wealth in the form of money or gifts to the bride's parents to make up for their loss of a daughter. The modern enactment of such a tradition was a house. However, buying a house in a city is no easy task for most urban dwellers. As suggested by a survey of Chinese homebuyers in 2018, the average age of Chinese homebuyers is 29.5. Since 90% of first-time homebuyers depend on loans, monthly repayments generally amount to 50% of their monthly income. Developers and fraudsters and all sorts of scam artists are also taking advantage of people's desperation to buy a home and coming up with all of these different crazy schemes that people seem to be buying into in order to get a home. So here's an example. Around 105 ready-for-sale houses in Oriental Bay, a premium neighborhood near downtown Shanghai, drew more than 700 cash-rich homebuyers. In the face of overwhelming demand, Shanghai uses a scoring system to determine eligible buyers. Launched in 2021, this system evaluates buyers based on factors like household ownership, marital status, and their pension contributions. This is where the scalpers come in. They can boost a buyer's qualifications and thus their chances of meeting the eligibility criteria to purchase sought-after properties. Local media reported that an anonymous buyer came across a newlywed couple at the sales office who didn't even know each other's names. Other scalpers offered loans or connected buyers to people with higher credit scores who could make purchases on their behalf. The incident highlights that real estate investment and speculation sentiment are still high in some cities where the price of first and second-hand houses is inverted. But despite all of the corruption and blatant, fragmented, and precarious nature of the housing market in China, there is no incentive for anyone to call off the system or to change it, amend it, or improve it from what it already is. The developers themselves need the pre-sale market to avoid collapsing entirely. So, for example, if the pre-sale market was called off, the immediate effect would be to cause developer after developer to fold, leading to a wave of new Lanwei-lo. Over the long term, there would be a dramatic slowdown in the property market, as the surviving companies would no longer be able to finance as many new housing projects. Despite all its problems, the pre-sale mechanism is an effective tool for getting large numbers of buildings off the ground quickly. Chinese developers are often able to recoup their entire investment within 8 months of purchasing a parcel of land. But if we're only allowed to sell completed homes, it takes 1.5 years to get an 18-story building complete. That's 3 times the current period for developers to get the money from buyers. The pressure on capital flow will be huge. And then even for local governments, land sales to property developers make up around 43% of their income. So there is just no incentive for anyone to change the system or to call the whole thing off or to start afresh. China's property market is kind of stuck where it is at the moment. As one SCMP article says it, the recovery for the market will probably be very slow. This is due to the pandemic, the general slowdown in the Chinese economy, and also people's real-term salary cuts, especially in the civil service. The head of one financial services firm said, "We expect sales to improve gradually for the rest of the year, but we do not think sales will see a strong recovery due to concern over the long-term outlook for the property market and declining disposable income among households in China." But it's not all bleak. Like I said earlier, the Chinese government is trying to help over-leverage companies. For example, Evergrande managed to make a deal with its creditors to work out a $19 billion offshore loan, which will go some way to paying off its $300 billion debt. And this will obviously set a precedent for other developers who may be able to get extensions, stay afloat for a few more years, complete the project that they have, and pay back the debts before a new system can be worked out. The fact still remains that this could take years to sort out. And I think it's really incredible as well that, the private market in China has only been around for like 30 years. So it's all gone to pot very, very quickly. It's quite impressive, actually. It's a reflection of global conditions, right? Since 1992, as my parents always like to tell me, you had the first big crash, and then now we get a crash every like 10 years or even 5 years that just like throws everything into disarray. Nowadays, inflation is rampant, the cost of living is completely out of control, and it's generally hard for everyone to get on. And problems like this are only going to make it worse unless the government really sort of digs into regulation and takes back control. It's just capitalism with Chinese characteristics at the end of the day. They're having the same problems that everyone else is happening. So that just goes to show that it doesn't matter when you adopt capitalism, it's bound to go wrong at some point. I'm not even a communist. I am a regular Westerner, but you've got to hand it to capitalism. It really does have the ability to just, make the line go all the way up and come all the way down really, really quickly. And yeah, I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of these problems where the people in the middle get left behind, as like the people at the top continue to skim off the top, continue to ensure that what they have is protected, and, give everybody the tofu dregs, if you will, even though hardworking people in the middle classes are going to continue to suffer. I don't have a solution. I don't have like an alternative economic, financial system to suggest. It's just, I think that in this case, it's obvious that more regulation is needed, but I think that's the case for everything. And I think more accountability is definitely needed. It helps the living, I guess, in a democratic system. In China, all the people have is their ability to protest, and technically they don't even have that. So it would be interesting to kind of keep track of developments with the mortgage boycotters, and see if they're able to continue, if they actually get their properties in the end, what happens to their social credit rating. Yeah, and kind of like follow up with them. Perhaps in 2 years' time, we can see if they did actually get their houses in the end. But that's it from me this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. In the next episode, we've got another uplifting topic for next week. We're going to be talking about human trafficking in China. I've been doing reading about like marriage human trafficking and also child human trafficking in China and its purposes and like the methods and things like that. It's very bleak, but very interesting. So I'll be posting about that on YouTube. So if you have a question, like a part of a topic that you guys would like me to cover, you guys love asking me really difficult questions that I find really difficult to answer, but I will try my best to answer any questions that you may have in that episode. So go to my YouTube page, find the community post and, leave your comments there. I have a few shout outs today. So thank you to the person anonymously who bought me 5 coffees on Buy Me a Coffee. That was very generous of you. If you'd like to buy me a coffee to support this channel, the link is in the description of wherever you're listening or watching. You can give a one-off donation or sign up for a monthly membership. And shout out to my latest paid newsletter subscriber, Brendan.